Imagine this. You wake up in a darkness that is so deep that you can't even tell if your eyes are open. You instinctively try to sit up to turn on a light, but you hit your head against something that's just a few inches above you. You try to move your arms and instantly realize that there's something a few inches on top of and beside them as well. As you try moving your legs and notice it's no different, realization hits you. You're trapped. As claustrophobia and panic set in, you take a deep breath in order to scream for help, and only then is it when you notice how stale and thick the air is. There's no fresh air coming in. Wherever you are, you don't have much time before you run out of oxygen. You need to conserve it, but you have to scream. You have to ask for help and bang on this hard case that you're trapped in to try and get out. Otherwise, how will you survive? This is what happened to people in the stories that I'm about to tell you. All three of these women were pronounced dead and then buried, only to wake up trapped in a casket and probably unaware that to the world, they were already dead. Let's go visit their sort of final resting place. Are you ready? Then take my hand, hold it tight, and let's walk into the darkness together. In 2015, in the coastal town of La Entrada, Honduras, 16-year-old Neysi Perez wakes up in the middle of the night and realizes she really needs to use the restroom. Neysi's house is an older home where the restroom is outside, so Neysi gets out of the bed and proceeds to make her way to the door, when suddenly, somewhere nearby, there's a burst of gunshots that go off. Neysi wasn't expecting this, and the scare that it gave her seems to have caused her to lose consciousness. Shortly after this, her husband Rudy walks in and finds Neysi on the ground. Rudy and Neysi had been living with Neysi's parents since they got married a few months back, so when he walked in and saw her like that, he immediately went to wake them. When her parents saw her, they realized that Neysi was foaming at the mouth, and that led them to believe that she had been possessed by an evil entity. The parents quickly called for their local priest, and as soon as he arrived, they began to do an exorcism to rid her of the malevolent being that had taken her and her unborn baby hostage, because Neysi was 3 months pregnant at the time. Now, after a while of unsuccessfully performing the exorcism, Neysi continued to remain unconscious and was completely limp. So her family decided to switch tactics and they rushed her to the hospital. 3 hours later, doctors concluded that there was nothing else they could do, and that Neysi had passed away. Her family was distraught. A few hours before, they were all so happy with Neysi being a newlywed and having a new baby in the family, and now everything had changed. So suddenly. They prepared the arrangements for her burial, opting to bury Neysi in the wedding dress that she had worn not too long ago. Family said their final goodbyes, and then Neysi was laid to rest in an above-ground concrete tomb at La Entrada General Cemetery. Her family returned home heartbroken. The next day, as Jesus Villanueva, a cemetery worker, was passing nearby Neysi's grave, he began to hear strange noises coming from nearby. Eventually, he realized that the noises were screams, and that they had been coming from Neysi's tomb. He stood there thinking about the impossibility of what he was experiencing, and convinced himself that the screams were coming from somewhere else, and the sound just seemed to be coming from there. So, Jesus continued on his way and kept doing his job, trying not to think too much about it. Not too long after that, Rudy decided to pay his wife's tomb a visit. As he got closer, he began to hear screaming and banging noises coming from inside her tomb. He rushed over to it and confirmed what he was hearing. Neysi was alive and screaming for help. Rudy rushed over to Jesus and told him that his wife was alive and begged him to get her out of the grave. But Jesus was dead set on the idea that it was impossible for anyone to be alive in one of those tombs. Rudy left, desperate to find help. He came back with a group of family members, and they began using a sledgehammer to smash apart the tomb and pull out the casket, calling out to Neysi as they did. The viewing window in Neysi's casket had been smashed, and she had scratches on her forehead and bruises on her fingers. When Neysi's cousin touched her, she realized that Neysi's body was warm, and she could feel a faint heartbeat. The family immediately loaded up Neysi with casket and all into a truck and rushed her to the hospital. I'm sure that the hospital staff must have felt completely bewildered when they saw a group of people barging through the hospital doors carrying a casket. But they quickly got to work. The doctors asked the family members to remove Neysi from the casket and lay her down on a bed. Then they began to evaluate her and perform all kinds of tests. But try as they might, they could not get her to show any signs of life. The doctor declared Neysi dead once again, and the family had no choice but to put her back in the casket and bury her again. This time, there were no screams or noises heard. It is said that Neysi probably suffered a panic attack when she heard the gunfire and collapsed due to it, woke up after she was entombed and tried to get out, but died due to oxygen deprivation. However, no one can say officially for sure if Neysi was alive or not when they pulled her out of the tomb. Now, this story was featured about 9 years ago on a Spanish TV show named Primer Impacto. I know this because I was actually switching channels, and although I rarely watch TV in Spanish, the next up teaser they played before the commercial caught my interest. So I stayed to watch it. And in the show, they interviewed her husband and mother, and they were completely convinced without a doubt that Neysi was alive after the first burial. They were so convinced that they managed to convince me enough that all these years later, when I started to search for stories of people who had been buried alive and came across Neysi's story, I remembered it vividly. Now, unfortunately, I wholeheartedly believe that Neysi was alive when she was buried, but there's no way to prove it. In Babahoyo, Ecuador, 76-year-old Bella Montoya began to feel ill on June 19th. Her family decided that her symptoms were dire enough that they needed to take Bella to the hospital and have a doctor examine her. So at 9 a.m., she was admitted into the Martin y Casa hospital in the province of Dos Rios, and by noon she had suffered a stroke and was pronounced dead. Her son, Gilberto, was heartbroken. He repeatedly asked to see his mother's body, but the hospital staff refused. So he and a few other family members could do nothing but start preparations for his mother's funeral, as the hospital moved Bella's body to the funeral home. Now, they placed her in a casket and began to let her friends and family come in and say goodbye. As some approached the casket to place flowers on it, they began to hear a knocking sound. Now, because of all the noises surrounding them with the other guests, they didn't really realize that those knocks were coming from inside of the casket, until those knocks began to become blows. Bella's son immediately ran towards the casket and pried it open, screaming, "She's alive!" As soon as the casket opened, Bella was seen gasping for air. She began moving her arms, and as Gilberto helped her to sit up, the guests began to call 911. Bella was rushed right back to the same hospital by paramedics, where she was immediately checked and transferred to the intensive care unit. She spent a week there with doctors giving her family very little hopes of recovery, because she had certain organs in her body that were failing, along with other complications. Eventually, a week after her being rushed back into the hospital, her body finally gave up on her and she did pass away. The new cause of death was listed as cardiorespiratory arrest. They held another funeral for Bella and buried her as intended. This time, there were no knocks. In January of 2018, in Riachão dos Neves, Brazil, 37-year-old Rosangela Dos Santos was taken to the Hospital de Oeste in Bahia by concerned family members because Rosangela had been feeling weak and fatigued for a few weeks now. Rosangela did have a health condition where she suffered from fainting and had been taking medication for it since she had been 7 years old. Now, she spent a week in the hospital, and while she was there, suffered 2 separate heart attacks and was eventually pronounced dead due to septic shock. Rosangela's husband and family had a funeral for her, and then she was entombed at the Senhora Santana Cemetery the next day on the 29th of January. And then from February 9th to the 11th, the Dos Santos family began to receive visits from people who lived near the cemetery and had been hearing moaning and screaming coming from Rosangela's tomb. One of the neighbors actually said that they heard banging coming from inside of the tomb, but thought it had just been the kids who play around the cemetery. But when she got closer, she heard 2 groans that came from inside the tomb, and then everything was quiet. At first, the family thought that the neighbors were superstitious or maybe even crazy. They thought maybe it was a cat or kids playing tricks on people who live near the cemetery and passers-by. But eventually, there were too many people to deny that something was indeed going on. The family decided to go and see for themselves what was happening. They got to the cemetery and removed the heavy casket from the tomb. The family immediately noticed that the nails which had been nailed around the casket to keep it closed had been pushed up and loosened somewhat. When they opened the casket, they became horrified. Rosangela's body had turned on its side, which of course is not the way that you lay a body in a casket. The cotton that the funeral home had put up her nose and ears to prevent the corpse from leaking fluid during the funeral had come out or had been removed. There were also scratches on the coffin's top, and Rosangela had scratches on her forehead and bruises on her fingers that weren't there when she was buried 11 days ago. It was undoubtedly clear that Rosangela had fought for her life with everything she had. Rosangela's family tried to rush her to the hospital, but as they had been removing the casket from the grave and examining her, a very large crowd of people had formed, and as the family tried to maneuver their way through them with Rosangela's body, many of them were able to touch her and see for themselves that her body was still warm to touch. Once they did arrive at the hospital, the doctors evaluated Rosangela and declared her dead once again because they found no signs of life. And so her family had to unfortunately bury her again a second time. No one heard any noises come out of her tomb ever again. That's it for today. Share your thoughts on why you think these 3 women may have been wrongfully pronounced dead in the comments below. You can help my small channel grow by sharing it with others who love creepy tales of people who have been buried alive just like us. And please remember to like if you liked and subscribe if you want more. I'll see you next time.